It seemed unthinkable, but today Ukraine was attacked from every direction. Will we leave them to their fate? We thought it might be coming, but the scale and the speed with which it happened was still breathtaking. Tonight, Russian troops are fighting in the outskirts of Kiev. Nick Watt is here with the politics, David Grossman in Washington, Lisa Doucette is in Kiev. Ben Chu will tell you what it means for your gas bill. With all the latest on the invasion, we'll also hear from Obama's CIA Director David Petraeus, a former British Foreign Secretary, and the woman in charge of EU sanctions. Good evening. It's what so many had feared and struggled to avert. A full-blown invasion has been unleashed in Europe. The Russian panoply of war, from cruise missiles to airborne assault and hundreds of tanks, has been turned on the people of neighbouring Ukraine after weeks of Kremlin assurances that no such thing was planned. As if to carry on with this epic truth-bending, Russian officials today characterise it as a special military operation to protect people from genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. There's no evidence to support the idea of genocide. Rather, that claim has emerged recently as Russia set the scene for today's operations. Now, the attacks started with 100 cruise missile strikes across the country. These stretched right the way from areas bordering Russia in the east to places like Melitopol, to the outskirts of Kiev, to Ivano-Frankivsk, all the way over near the western border. Then ground columns started moving in from several different points, but critically north from Crimea, to the southwest from Russia towards Kharkiv, and south from Belarus towards Kiev. Then later this morning, the Russians launched an air assault operation with helicopters targeting the Hostomel airfield on the northwest side of Kiev. Pictures from the ground, unverified but we believe genuine, show the Russian helicopters taking fire from Ukrainian forces as they go in, including a surface-to-air missile. One stricken chopper crashed into the Dnieper River. And that's what we can see here. The crew ejected and can be seen descending by parachute. But the assault went on, being recorded by nearby residents, and Russian airborne troops seized the airfield by late morning. One reporter from CNN even saw the Russians close up securing the airfield. Now, note the arm and helmet markings, recognition signs, as two sides with the same language and weaponry come into contact. Now, if we go back to the big picture, what we can see is the site of that air assault near Kiev, and the high likelihood is that the ground column coming down from Belarus will head for the airport. But tonight, the Ukrainians claim to have retaken the airport. Russian military objectives remain very ambitious, though, quite possibly to cut the country in two by simultaneous thrusts to the west of the River Dnieper. Now the initial surprise is over. Ukrainian forces are fighting back, but they were overwhelmed in many places this morning, and Russian media has shown various pictures of prisoners like these. But some have been taken by the Ukrainians too, and there's some evidence that they've been knocking out armoured vehicles. Russia has committed only a small proportion of its forces so far, but resistance seems to be consolidating. There are guerrilla-type actions starting, so the Russians may find their early advances slow down and leave them with vulnerable supply lines. We don't yet know how many people lost their lives today. An initial Ukrainian estimate put it at 57 on their side, but in blazing buildings and crashed aircraft, there will undoubtedly have been more who have perished. Two societies with so much culture and history in common are now locked in a mortal battle. It could easily become a brother against brother struggle within the Slav family, with all the emotion that generates. Our international editor, Gabriel Gatehouse, has been watching and decoding today's developments.
Despite weeks of build-up and anticipation, when the invasion began, it felt like the unthinkable had happened. fighter jets streaking through the sky over the capital city of a European country under attack from its nuclear-armed neighbour. The Russians fired missiles at targets across the country, from east to west.
I woke up personally in 5 a.m. from the explosion of the airport, which was about 10-minute drive from my home, and it's just like it was like extremely like a massive explosion. Yeah, and then there were like explosions all around. You could see this, lights, lightnings, like it was like almost like lightnings, and then you hear the roar after that.
On the outskirts of the capital, Ukrainian forces scrambled near an airbase just north of Kiev. Russian helicopters were filmed swooping over the base. They're bombing the airport, the voice says. There must be 30 of them at least. 400 miles to the east, another airbase came under attack. The strikes also hit residential buildings, injuring civilians. I never thought such a thing could happen, this woman says. Not in my lifetime. I'm lucky to be alive, but I'll do anything to protect Ukraine. In the nearby city of Kharkiv, right on the Russian border, people sheltered in train and metro stations. A local journalist contacted me to say she'd also been woken at 5 in the morning by the sound of shelling. In the south, a column of Russian military vehicles was seen crossing into Ukrainian territory from Crimea, which Russia annexed 8 years ago. A lone woman was filmed remonstrating with a Russian soldier.
There's been hundreds of casualties already. There's been a lot of explosions. There's a lot of shellings. There's been a lot of fire from both sides. A lot of so it's extremely dramatic and extremely tragic what happens right now. I mean, a lot of people will start comprehending this in a while because it's all so fast.
In Kiev, as the evening curfew approached, the roads were still clogged with people trying to get out, many expecting an imminent assault on the capital.
Yeah, I'm in the car.
Ah, you're in the car.
They're going to storm Kiev, so that's why kind of, many people decide that it's time to think of logistics. So that's why I'm doing the same. So sorry.
In Russia, meanwhile, there were small protests in Moscow and in other cities. No to war, they chanted. They were quickly dragged away by the police. More than 1,500 people were arrested across the country. Those who are brave enough to voice their opposition to the Kremlin fear there may be worse to come, both for Ukraine and at home too.
I was horrified. Hadn't expected this. I sensed what was coming from Monday, but was still unwilling to believe it. The only goal of an autocrat is the preservation of power. If this does not endanger his position, so why not do this?
So far, the Russian strikes have focused mainly on military bases. It's not clear exactly how far this invasion will extend, nor how long it will last. But whatever happens next, the world changed today. Putin crossed a Rubicon, and we are entering perhaps the most dangerous moment in Europe since the end of the Cold War.
Gabriel Gatehouse there. So the wider world tries to calculate how far Russia could go and what on earth they might do to affect the outcome. To consider those questions, we're joined by General David Petraeus, who was CIA director under Barack Obama after serving 37 years in the US Army. General Petraeus, welcome to Newsnight. How far do you think Putin might go with this invasion?
First of all, he's got to get to the Dnieper and take Kyiv. I think the message from today, or the takeaway from today, is that if I were a Russian commander, I'm not sure I would be satisfied with what we have achieved. There was certainly much less shock and awe. Again, I was part of an invasion as a two-star general 2, 3, and 4-star in Iraq and then Afghanistan. And again, what was achieved today was less than I expected. We have all known that the Russians can overwhelm the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians can't stand toe-to-toe armor forces to armor, but they have been able to do what we sort of hoped, I guess. I've been to the front line in Donbass. I was impressed by the sheer toughness of the Ukrainians, by the commitment. But, rhetoric is one thing, and when the bullets start flying and the bombs start dropping, that's another thing. And it sounds as if, from the reports that are aggregated and brought in from social media and other sources, that the Ukrainians have actually delayed them fairly impressively. You talked about the airfield. That airfield is crucial outside Kyiv because presumably they put an air assault force on the ground so that then you can air land much larger forces with fixed wing aircraft, not just helicopters. And it sounds like by different reports, the Ukrainians may have taken it back. At the very least, it is not secure. Same in another airfield outside Kyiv. Really, it's only out of Crimea that you see a fairly rapid advance. And by the way, let's also keep in mind that they don't appear to have shut down the Ukrainian command and control system. They haven't even grounded the Ukrainian Air Force, as modest as it is. So I, first of all, expect to see a lot more tonight with missiles and rockets and fixed wing bombers and so forth. But they can't be that satisfied with today. They presumably want to take Kyiv. They want to displace or replace the government. But before we start talking about even how far they'll go inside Ukraine, this really brings us back to what many of us have said, which is this is a huge country. The population's 50% bigger than what we went into in Iraq, and many of them, in the beginning, they did applaud us. So this is, I think, going to be a much more difficult challenge than perhaps some of the Russians have thought.
But if you're right, and things have slowed, they certainly seem to have slowed since this morning, when there were some very rapid initial gains.
Yeah, but now they have to refuel. At some point they have to sleep, they have to eat, they have to end the Ukrainians. If they can take advantage of that, that's when you really set them back.
But does that potentially pose really big dangers for Vladimir Putin internally if people see that the army has not been able to achieve even a small proportion of what it set out to do? And what are his options then?
Well, you talked about the demonstration on the streets, and this is despite them being told that if they're arrested, they will have a criminal record and all that goes with that. So, again, I don't want to overdo this at all, but what I do want to do is emphasize that, again, I just am a little bit underwhelmed by what the Russians have achieved on day one. It is not, even the pictures that various news channels have shown of the columns of vehicles, much less substantial than what we shoved across the border in Kuwait in just the first 12 hours. So, and then can they integrate air and ground? Can they actually get all the combined arms put together and so forth? This is very, very challenging stuff. Right. And by the way, the ground is not as frozen as I think they hoped it would be. You could see the mud on the tracks of the tanks and so forth. The trafficability is difficult if you go off-road.
Right. But in terms of the possibility of escalation, even if it isn't going to plan, is there serious jeopardy for NATO? I'm looking at something President Putin said when announcing this operation. He said that if the West tries to interfere, you will face consequences greater than any you've faced in history. It appears to be a nuclear threat. And previous Russian exercises seem to have involved the use of nuclear weapons. Is that a real threat that people should worry about in NATO countries, do you think?
Well, it's a threat that people should worry about, certainly. And it's one that we have to make sure that he never operationalizes. And so you've seen President Biden, other leaders are deploying additional forces into the 3 Baltic states. 2 of those are the only real land border with Russia itself. Obviously, if he takes all of Ukraine and goes all the way to the west, then you have the entire Polish border with in a NATO country, of course. But, you have the Article 5 agreement there, and that is a serious one. And I should just mention, clearly Putin is out to make Russia great again, if you will, to coin a phrase. He's also made NATO great again. I was at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. I have not seen unity like we saw there since I was a young speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe in the final years of the Cold War. The Western world is quite united on this. Yes, they did not get the SWIFT sanctions. That was clear from President Biden's press conference this afternoon. But there are quite severe sanctions. And again, we'll see which of the individuals around Putin are designated by name and so forth. See if you get it into the circle of the top 25. But this is starting to bite. And again, the Russian people apparently do have some reservations and worries about this. Wait till the caskets start coming home covered by Russian flags.
I do wonder in the way we're considering this topic, whether we are assuming a rational decision-making calculus in the Kremlin, and should we be, given some of the statements we've heard from President Putin, rambling, historical, dark kind of messages in recent days, should we assume that he's a rational actor, or is he just going all out to try and reconquer Ukraine in what he sees as a historic mission and will use any means necessary?
Well, this is Ukraine. Again, keep in mind that he has had success in military operations in the past. He eventually achieved success in Chechnya, although he had to destroy Grozny to save it and then find a brutal dictator to pay off to keep the peace, if you will. He did take the two areas of Georgia. He stabilized Bashar al-Assad on the throne, if you will, in Damascus. And of course, he occupied Crimea and supported the separatists in the Donbass in Ukraine. But this is a vastly bigger challenge for him and for his forces. 190,000 sounds like a lot, but when you actually take out all the guys that are in tanks and artillery and logistics and all the rest of that, if you go into a major city, you need boots on the ground, you need infantry. Right. He doesn't have anywhere near enough. I mean, I'm also struck that today, the only major, if you will, area actually seized at major city, Chernobyl, which I'm sure was not particularly heavily defended.
Mixed blessing. Yeah, absolutely. Lastly, just briefly, if I may, clearly sanctions will require stoicism, in a sense, politically in the West.
Yes.
We see a lot of concern about gas prices in the US. Does it help that President Trump, former President Trump, is talking about what a smart guy Putin is and what a great stroke he's pulled? Does it undermine domestic support potentially?
Well, what I said earlier when asked about this, actually, I think it was on CNN, I said, look, you know, we used to have a saying that politics stops at the water's edge. And of course, when you have a situation like this, everyone rallies around the flag and, in fact, our leader. And that's clearly what we should be doing at this point in time. Vladimir Putin has not just assaulted Ukraine, he has assaulted democracy. He has assaulted the principles that undergird the United Nations Charter and have generally done pretty well for our world ever since the end of World War II.
General Petraeus.
And so this is vastly bigger than just an assault on Ukraine, and we need to come together. The president has brought the U.S. and Europe and the other democracies of the world together. We need to make sure that all of our political leaders do the same.
General Petraeus, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well,
Pleasure.
to update us now from Kiev, we're joined by the BBC's chief international correspondent, Lisa Snowdon. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us in what I'm sure has been a very difficult day there. Does it feel tonight that a city, like a city in the grip of war?
Well, here I am in Kiev, a capital, a very European capital, in the midst of what's being described as a war in Europe. Not far from where I am, in the underground stations, thousands of people are spending the night. And in bomb shelters, some of them are too crowded, people are being turned away. And it's like that in cities and towns across Ukraine. And thousands are taking to their cars to head out to Poland, to Hungary, to Romania, to try to find shelter. And those who are staying are going to take up the appeal from their president in the early hours of the morning, who said, come and donate blood. Come, if you have any battle experience, pick up a gun. Because what it's coming down to is for all of the unprecedented resolve and coordination of sanctions and sharing of intelligence, all that matters in standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians. It comes down to what President Zelensky said time and again: when the war starts, it will be Ukrainians facing off against Russians.
Lise, thank you very much and stay safe. Well, we were hearing there about the experience of Ukrainians under this bombardment today, and there have been many remarkable images and stories already emerging. Sima Katecha has been speaking to a family separated by the war.
In the morning, I woke up from the noise of some bombing, and first in the head, like, what's happening, what's going on. To be honest, I heard the shaking of the windows, so it was such a good noise that it was just shaking all over the place. And about the feelings, I just remember that the heart was just like, I understood that what's going to happen now. We have curtains closed, so nobody could see what is going on inside.
A family separated by war. Rita Miles and her 4 children in the north of Ukraine. Their husband and father Andrew in the south of England.
Apprehensive, very upset, very worried about their future, about them being hurt or worse. So it's a nervy time.
They're constantly in touch on Skype, at least for as long as the internet connection is there. Under cover of darkness, Rita says there's an uncomfortable stillness in the neighbourhood.
Usually we have lots of lights around the house and also outside, but we had recommendations to switch everything off, not to bring some attention.
What is the plan now? Because obviously Rita's in Ukraine, you're in the UK.
We've got fuel for the car and fuel cans to get the car probably about 400 kilometres, but it's about 550 to the border. So we kind of got those plans, but at the moment it's not safe to move.
Ukrainian people right now feel some strength in their souls and in their brains. Everybody ready just to go out and fight.
Just down the road, another family barricading themselves in their basement. The youngest, just 1. The eldest, 82. Memories of the Second World War rushing back.
Господи, Мати Божа, що ж це таке опять за нападіння на нас? Опять немає житті. Боже, я в 40-му году родилася. Уже 82 годи, і оце так приходиться доживати опять во время Другої війни. Господи, прости мене наше. Ой.
As fighting rages across the country, Rita and her children feel paralysed. You were supposed to come to the UK tomorrow, knowing that you're now not going to be able to make that trip and that you are apart from the man that you love. That must be having a really big impact on you.
That's not a great feeling, to be honest, and we were hoping that we can stay together, and kids were upset, and I could see today some fear on their faces.
Tonight, they'll hunker down here to escape the threat of further violence.
This is the basement, which we installed in case of some bombing.
Sima Katecha reporting there. In a moment, we'll speak to Svetlana Zalishchuk, former member of the Ukraine Parliament and a current foreign policy advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister there. But first to Moscow and its claims for this current operation. Just before we came on air, I got through to SERGEI MARKOV, a former member of the Duma for Vladimir Putin's party, and indeed the Russian spokesman's president for 6 years. SERGEI MARKOV, when Russia talks about an operation to prevent genocide, do you think anyone outside Russia will believe that?
Yes, of course. I think majority of those who has access to information believe in this. You may know that during 7 years of, in fact, policy of government of terrorism, or Kiev repressive regime against people in Donbass, 2,600 people civilians mostly have been killed.
Yes, they've died, but that's not genocide.
Shelling.
They've died, but that's not genocide. No one like the OSCE or the others who were there during that 7 years are claiming that genocide was taking place. These international organizations didn't claim it's genocide because they are on the influence of such countries like United States, and it's a lie. And in Kiev repressive regime is a puppet regime of United States of America. You say that this has been going on for 7 years, and yet even in the very recent past, a few days ago, Russia was giving assurances that it had no plans to invade Ukraine, that troops would go home from Belarus after their military exercises there, and that there was a kind of war hysteria among Western leaders. So why should anyone trust Russia again, given those assurances?
I think you shouldn't trust Russia. Leaders now, and as exactly we are Russians, don't trust Western leaders right now because because all such leaders like President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Macron, all of them lying very crystally all the time. And Vladimir Putin called this US-led coalition as empire of lie. It's exactly the truth. As about Vladimir Putin, you can trust him, everything what he told, but not during the last couple of months. Last couple of months, I think it was...
When did he stop telling the truth then?
I think a couple of months ago, Vladimir Putin stopped telling the truth about this specific issue on Ukraine because the decision had been made about preparation for the military liberation of Ukraine, something about 2 months ago, and then these slogans about no plans of invasion was already not truth, but not lie.
All right,
was military disinformation of the enemies.
Okay, I absolutely hear what you're saying, Sergei, but does that mean that when President Macron or Chancellor Scholz went to Moscow trying to talk peace, it was all just a charade from the Russian point of view?
Not exactly, because Russia prepared for the military operation, but Russia tried to avoid this military operation all these days. Russia demands is very, very simple. First, implementation of Minsk agreement by Kiev regime, which is 100% responsible for violation of this Minsk agreement. Second, denazification of Ukraine. Then third, liberation of the political prisoners in Ukraine, and stopping of the policy of political terror against those who disagree with Kiev repressive regime.
Thank you, Sergei Markov. Well, let's go now to Svetlana Zalishchuk, who is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, was one, I beg your pardon, and chair of its European Affairs Committee, and now a foreign policy advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister. Svetlana, you've had to leave Kiev today. Can you just explain to us what's happened to you personally?
Yes, so I woke up in the morning in the downtown of Kiev city, and I live by one of the oldest church in this part of the world. But instead of hearing bell ringing, we've heard 8 super powerful blasts. We decided for some time to stay in the city and to help some journalists to report on what's going on. However, it's not my job at the moment, but I was trying to help the world to see and hear what's happening on the ground. But later on, we received the message that we expect shelling of the city and it's most safe to leave. So I packed this, hand luggage suitcase, all my life put just in there, and left the city. And I'm not sure whether I will come back to my home, to my life, to my capital.
Now, while we've been on air, we've heard that the government has banned men of military age from leaving the country. And of course, there was a general mobilization order last night. I just wonder whether there's any feeling at all that maybe your president left it late with some of these steps to mobilise the country?
I'll say that, first of all, I'd like my country to be better prepared, but also I would say this, that I would like the whole world would be better prepared and the whole world would support Ukraine more. We know that number of partners refuse to provide us weapons, and some of, like Germany, provided us with 5,000 helmets. I'm not sure that it's helping right now at the moment that we are standing against one of the most powerful army in the world with nuclear weapons, threatening us with it on the air, on the land, and on the sea. So I think it's a question not only to Ukrainian president, but to the whole international community, because in the end, it's not a blow on Ukraine. It's not the war between Ukraine and Russia. It's a blow on human dignity, on human values, on human lives. And I can't reconcile with the idea that, you have been asking some guests about this NATO unity. I can't reconcile with the idea that we celebrate this unity as some achievement. It's not achievement, because at the moment, with the background of this unity, you still have children and civilians are dying in heart of Europe. This is the European war. Putin is Hitler #2.
Let me ask you. No, I don't want to jump in too much, but let me ask you about NATO, the EU, request tonight from the government for military aid. Obviously, people in the EU would say, well, look, we've just unveiled a whole lot of economic sanctions. But what do you need more than that? What is the urgent requirement, do you think, now for Ukraine?
First of all, I think that sanctions should have been imposed before. And I think that then the calculus for Putin would be completely different. Why? Because he would feel it, people around him would feel it, oligarchs, population would feel it. And I think that the ruble would feel it, Russian currency would have felt it. So I think that it's a little bit too late to have the sanctions now. Of course, it will have an impact. It's already having an impact. But I think if these sanctions came in time, we would could have prevented what is happening now, because the pressure from inside Russia could have been much, much, much bigger. Moreover, I would like to remind you just quickly that, he started the war against Georgia 2008 and Ukraine 2014. We had enough time to calculate what Putin is capable for.
Yes. Thank you, Svetlana Zalushchuk. Thank you very much indeed. Stay safe. Well, let's look now at the attempts to marshal a common response to these momentous events in London and Washington. And we're joined now by Nick Watt and David Grossman. Well, Nick is here in the studio. A late-night cabinet meeting tonight. What did you glean about what went on there?
Yes, and after a very long day for Boris Johnson, he was, of course, woken at 4 a.m. Within minutes, he was speaking to President Zelensky. And interestingly, for someone who's not overly religious, Boris Johnson told the president of Ukraine that he was praying for his country. And as you said, Mark, at 8:30 this evening, the Prime Minister did convene that meeting of the cabinet, and he opened with these words: "This has been a dark day in the history of our continent." Now, the cabinet was addressed by the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee and the chief of the Defence Staff, and they provided their assessment of what they think will happen in Ukraine in the coming days. And they told the cabinet it's going to be grim, it's ominous, and that's for two principal reasons. Ukraine has been invaded by a superpower with formidable military hardware. And then this assessment: the harder the Ukrainians resist, and there's a lot of evidence, the cabinet was told, of very serious Ukrainian resistance, the harder they resist, the assessment says, the more brutal Vladimir Putin will be in his response. And then finally, the Prime Minister wanted to get this message across to the cabinet, which is Putin must fail. Putin will fail. And that was very much a message the Prime Minister delivered a few hours earlier to the House of Commons.
And it's vital for the safety of every nation that Putin's squalid venture should ultimately fail and be seen to fail. However long it takes, that will be the steadfast and unflinching goal of the United Kingdom.
Now, in terms of the meat of that announcement, what was there on sanctions?
Well, a significant ratcheting up with the assets of 100 individuals and entities frozen, and that is directly aimed at making life uncomfortable for people who, I was told, are extremely close to Vladimir Putin. And one member of the cabinet suggested to me that the hope is that this might prompt a palace coup against President Putin from people, I was told, will have to pull their kids out of expensive schools and will no longer be able to moor their yachts in Monaco. And the hope is that they will turn on Vladimir Putin and say, you are to blame for this. And then this is what this member of the cabinet told me. We're hoping that one of them will wield the dagger. We're not going to do that. It will take time, but there's high hopes that that is where this will end up.
Thank you, Nick, for that update. Well, we're now joined by David Grossman, who's in Washington. David, Joe Biden addressed the American people tonight from the White House. How's he meeting this moment, do you think?
Well, today, Mark, we got to see the hand, or at least some of it, that Joe Biden has been suggesting that he holds and is ready to play in the event of that full-scale Russian invasion. And given that for weeks now he's been telling us that he has no intention of putting US forces into Ukraine to take on Russian forces, it was by necessity more of the same sorts of sanctions that we've seen unveiled over the preceding few days. Yes, they were harsher, deeper, encompassing more individuals and more Russian businesses, but sanctions nonetheless. Also today, though, we did get a military component to the response, moving US forces within Europe to bolster NATO's eastern flank, and the announcement of 7,000 new US troops being moved into the region to do the same job. The president told the American public today that every inch of NATO territory would be defended with the full power of American force. And if the president had a central message today, though, it was this: all the pain, all the suffering, all the hardship, all the death, and all the frightening instability that's being unleashed on the world is the fault of Russia and its leader.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies.
I mean, despite him talking about minimising, there's references to gas prices, that type of thing. Do you think he's carrying the American people with him?
Well, much of what he said today, Mark, was designed to try and do just that. He said time and time again that America has an interest in sorting out what's happening and standing up to Russia. If they don't, it will be worse, and it will impact on the American people. America stands up to bullies, he said. That's who we are. The issue, though, hasn't so far been spared the rancorous division that beset American politics. Though today, I have to say, there was large degrees of unanimity between the parties. How long that lasts, though, is another matter. As you say, American petrol prices are almost double what they were before the pandemic. And if you go into American supermarkets, you can see that the supply chain is still under significant pressure. And although the president said in that clip that we've just heard that he was seeking to minimize the impact on American families, well, it's clear there is still going to be some pain to be felt by them. And given that this president already has approval ratings that have taken significant hits over recent months, it's clear that that might not end well for him and his approval in the future.
David, thank you. Well, since the US and NATO have been very particular in saying that they won't send troops to defend Ukraine, their options tend to be economic. They're relying on banking blockade and monetary missiles to turn around Russian tanks. Some measures had already been announced, but a whole lot more have been unveiled today. Our economics editor Ben Chu has the details and the possible effects on you. Ben.
Yes, Mark, the Western economic sanctions on Russia today were tightened up. More asset freezes, more company sanctions, technology export bans, but they were still some distance from the full economic bazooka many had called for. There was pressure, including, we're told, from Downing Street, for Russian banks to be excluded from SWIFT, which connects the global finance system. But for now, the US, the EU and the UK stopped short of this. And there was no sanctioning of the giant Russian energy exporting giants Gazprom and Rosneft. This means Europe will continue, again, at least for now, to buy and import millions of barrels a day of Russian oil and gas. But what does all this mean for ordinary households in the West, including in the UK? Well, there's huge uncertainty, not least because we don't know what Russia's reaction will be. Its foreign ministry tonight said Russia would respond harshly to the sanctions in accordance with the principle of reciprocity. But it didn't outline any specifics. Nevertheless, we can already say with some confidence that this invasion will make the cost of living vice around Western households even tighter, especially in Europe. Why? Well, the central and inescapable fact is that Russia supplies 40% of Europe's gas and a quarter of its oil imports. In light of that, even the potential for disruption to energy supplies due to this invasion moves markets. So let's have a look at what happened to the market price of oil today. It shot up 7% to above $104 a barrel. The spiking oil price in recent weeks has already pushed the cost of a litre of petrol in the UK on forecourts to record highs of £1.49 a litre, and it will now likely go even higher. And what about domestic heating bills? This chart shows what happened to the UK wholesale natural gas price today after the Russian invasion. At one point, it was up 60% at 345p per therm. Now, this wholesale gas price is really important because it more or less determines what you pay for your home energy bill. One analyst noted today that if wholesale prices remain at this level, average household energy bills, already due to rise to £1,971 a year in April, could hit £3,000 in October. The impact of this invasion on Russian and Ukrainian wheat, metal and other agricultural and technological commodity inputs are other ways in which economic damage could spill over to the West. Yet energy is the most immediate threat. The last time energy supplies to the West were seriously disrupted was the 1970s. This contributed to the imposition here in the UK of a 3-day week to conserve energy and recession. Now, we're not back there yet, of course, but the clouds are darkening rapidly and we're considerably closer than anyone would surely have thought possible at the beginning of 2022. Mark.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Ben. Well, to explore the possibilities for action by the West, we're joined by Mairead McGuinness, the Financial Services Commissioner at the European Commission, whose job is to enforce sanctions imposed by the EU, and also by David Miliband, who was Foreign Secretary in Gordon Brown's government at the time of Russia's conflict with Georgia and is now President of the International Rescue Committee Aid Organisation. Welcome to you both. Mairead McGuinness, let's start off with the EU sanctions package rolled out today and all sorts of points in there. But can we start with that issue that President Biden explicitly highlighted in his address to the nation tonight, that Europe is not ready to go to sanctions on the SWIFT banking system, the transaction system?
Well, firstly, yes, today the leaders have adopted the broad sanctions that people are discussing. And on SWIFT, there is an understanding of a discussion around the table. But it's important to remember that some of what we're doing around the banking sector will have implications literally close to what would happen with a ban on SWIFT. I think the truth of it is that what the US is doing will have a similar consequence. And I think when you take together what the allies are doing collectively, the impact on the Russian economy will be very significant. You saw what happened to the currency today and to the stock market. And essentially, we have to choke off the supply of finance that funds the war machine of Russia. And I think the collective action of the EU, the US, the UK, Canada, Japan, working together is, defending democracy and using every sanction possible so that we will have an impact, and a serious impact, on the Russian economy.
Now, in terms of choking off the finance to Russia, that's one thing. But there's also European countries worried about their own finances and the rules that the Commission puts in place, the fiscal rules, and whether they can help their people through what might be a very difficult period with rising energy prices if you don't relax those rules. Is that about to happen, do you think?
Look, we're in uncharted waters here. So, first of all, we do the sanctions and we work with our allies. That's really important. Of course, there are consequences for the Western world. You've already analysed that on the programme, energy in particular. And I think the member states around the table know that there are consequences, but they are prepared to deal with those consequences. There will be a discussion as to how we do it, but we're not there yet in terms of the Growth and Stability Pact. That is on the table anyway, in general, post-COVID. But clearly, what has happened today in Ukraine, where there's a war in Europe, will put a different emphasis on the measures we take to actually tackle what has been a disaster for the people of Ukraine who are dying today, being attacked by Russia, and it has wider implications. So we have to defend democracy, we have to provide humanitarian aid for the people of Ukraine, we have to look after refugees, and we have to think of how we deal with the economic consequences. But today isn't about how it will impact us. Today is about what do we do to show solidarity with an independent country that is under attack.
Thank you, Mairead McGuinness. Let's bring in David Miliband. You heard what Mairead McGuinness had to say there about trying to choke off the finances in Russia. Do you think what's been announced today by the EU, by the UK and US as well, is going to be sufficient? Is it the big bazooka required to change President Putin's thinking?
Well, it's not a big bazooka in hard power terms. It's intended, I think, to play a longer-term game. And the truth is, President Putin has been planning this for at least the last 8 years since the invasion of Crimea, and probably for longer. It's a fundamental attempt to rewrite the rules of the post-Cold War international order, and specifically the European order. And I don't think that a few months of planning is going to produce the kind of quote-unquote bazooka that you've referred to. I think we have to prepare for a much longer campaign in which defensive measures are going to be necessary, potentially military defensive measures for countries in the Baltics, defensive measures in respect of the getting off Russian dependence on Russian oil and gas, which is a significant part of Europe's dependence at the moment, but also an understanding that there is a bigger global picture here. And watching the comments in the UN Security Council, it's very, very striking to see African countries like Kenya responding very strongly, is like India not. So I think there's a global picture as well as a European picture. No one should expect a quick, short, sharp answer to this. I'm afraid it's going to be a very long-term effort.
And in terms of the work you now do with the International Rescue Committee, what are your projections about refugees potentially coming west to flee this situation?
I mean, basically, they're all very bad in the sense that there are two clear options at the moment. One is that there's a full-fledged war inside the country, or there's an occupation because the invasion works very quickly. In either case, we expect a large number of refugees to head west. We've had a team in Poland over the last 3 weeks looking at the different organizations on the ground in Poland, or also exploring partnerships inside Ukraine, because they'll be internally displaced as well as refugees who cross borders. But it's good news that Poland and Slovakia have announced today that their borders are open to Ukrainians who are fleeing. The UN says 100,000 people have fled, have shifted already, not yet left the country. But I think we have to prepare for a much larger scale refugee flow in Europe than was the case, for example, in the Balkans in the 1990s, simply because the numbers of people who live in Ukraine, 44 million or so, is much larger.
Mairead McGuinness, just hearing what David Miliband was saying there about the refugees, clearly Poland is going to be very important as a potential receiving point here for hundreds of thousands, maybe even more people. But the Commission has a rather difficult relationship with Poland over its rule of law and some of the things the government have done. Does helping refugees now take priority in terms of assisting the Polish government to deal with this crisis?
Well, Europe is united. All member states have approved the sanctions. That is significant and important. Poland knows what Russia is like, so the willingness to help, particularly those member states who border and are close to Ukraine, is absolute. And already, as David has said, preparations have been made so that we knew this was going to happen, perhaps not quite today, but the preparations were in place. So I don't see any disunity at EU level. I don't see any disunity with the Western allies who have announced packages already, including ours. And in fact, it is our unity that will be our ultimate strength. And Putin has tried to divide Europe, and I think his intention is to continue to do that, which is why we have to be very strong in our resolve to stand with the people of Ukraine and make sure that we can do everything possible to help them in their plight. But I do have to say one thing. This is not going to end soon, and therefore the work we're doing around sanctions will have an impact over time, and there may be a need to revisit, because what has happened today is really a stark reminder of when Putin was sitting down and discussing with leaders that his intentions were absolutely clear. He had every intention of invading Ukraine and ignoring those who favour diplomacy.
Thank you. And David Miliband, just lastly, I noticed both of you talking about the need for patience here and time, but it does remind me somewhat of things that were said about Saddam Hussein when he was under strict sanctions, and things that were said, for example, about Iran. I mean, how long are we talking about here, do you think, needing to maintain a tight grip on Russian access to finance, for example? Is it many years, potentially?
Definitely. I mean, remember, President Putin is trying to rewrite 30 years of history. He's trying to go back to 1990 with the lessons of the last 30 years and ensure that Russia does not have to be an agenda taker from the West. He's determined to rewrite the geography of Europe as well as the rules of the international order. And that's why this is so significant. I don't think we should kid ourselves that this is a matter of a few months. This is a long-term aim. And if you look at the map of Europe and the incursion that is potentially represented by an occupation of Ukraine and an effective annexation of Belarus, you can immediately see that countries in the Baltics have good reason to be fearful. And there's hundreds of miles border then between effectively Russian territory and European Union territory. That's very significant indeed.
David Miliband, Mairead McGuinness, thank you both indeed very much for joining us on Newsnight. Inevitably, at moments like this, people reach for historical comparisons. The talk turns to the 1930s or the biggest conflict since 1945, what have you. Certainly, it's been clear since Russia annexed Crimea and first entered eastern Ukraine 8 years ago that Vladimir Putin did not respect the principle that territorial or political disputes shouldn't be solved by force. But these latest actions take it to a wholly different level. So is this the last time, the last gasp, I beg your pardon, of an ageing Cold Warrior, or the new pattern for authoritarian regimes around the world?
Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful.
Well, now joining us, we have two eminent historians, author of War, How Conflict Shaped Us, Professor Margaret Macmillan, and author of Civilization, the West and the Rest, Professor Neil Ferguson. Welcome to you both. Margaret Macmillan, you hear these historical comparisons being made, but I just wonder whether you have any, feel there's any merit to the idea, or would have done before the events of this week, that maybe NATO had expanded too fast or ignored traditional Russian security interests.
We would, but that's in a way neither here nor there today. NATO was asked by the countries that were emerging from the Soviet Union, such as Poland, if they could become members, and said that they could. I mean, I think there was a desperation on the part of some of these countries to get away from the grip of the Soviet Empire. And I suppose now we can look back and say we should have been more careful. We should have been more careful with our diplomacy with the Soviet Union. But that seems to me something that we can discuss another time, if you like. I think what is really important now is what's happened today. And the principle that territory should not be seized and claimed by force, which has been more or less observed since the Second World War, has now been firmly breached. And I think that will encourage others to do it. So I think looking back will perhaps help us to understand how it happened, but it isn't going to really help us now deal with what's happening.
Right. And Neil, in terms of the historical perspective, the lens through which we should see Putin's mindset, did you buy Joseph Biden's idea that he's trying to recreate the USSR?
Well, this is what one often hears, but I don't think it's the right analogy. I think if one studies of Vladimir Putin, what he's trying to do is not to resurrect the Soviet Union, but rather to resurrect the Tsarist Russian Empire. Now, from the vantage point of Ukraine, that might have rather similar implications, because it's clear that Putin sees Ukraine as an integral part of Russia. He published an article last year on the historical unity of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples, making the argument that really Ukraine had no legitimacy as an independent state. Peter the Great's his hero much more than Stalin. Now, the key thing here, and here I agree with Margaret Macmillan, is that the people of Ukraine want a very different future. If you look at recent opinion polls, including one that just was published today, Ukrainian people want a westward orientation. Not only do they want to live under a democracy that is not corrupt, but more importantly here, they want to be part of NATO and they want to be in the European Union. And you can see under the circumstances why there is popular desire to be in NATO, because if you're not in NATO, as is now very clear, you're vulnerable to the aggression of Vladimir Putin.
Margaret, I mean, given those aspirations, I just wonder whether it's going to be the case that despite everything the West says, and we just heard from David Miliband and Mairead McGuinness about how long sanctions might take to work, that this is going to come down to a very sort of 19th century idea about national strength and national character, blood and iron, that ultimately it's the success or failure of the Ukrainian people to come through this that is going to be the key determinant.
I'm afraid we are going to be looking at that. And of course, we're dealing with two very different timeframes. I mean, what is likely to happen in Ukraine, and I think it's hard to make predictions at the moment, is this is going to end fairly soon. And there will be some sort of government provided, I imagine, by the Russians in Ukraine. There'll be some sort of settlement. But there's a much longer time frame which the West is thinking of and which it has to think of, because I think Neil Ferguson is right. I think President Putin wants to recreate the Russia of the Tsars. He's managed to get Belarus under his thumb. He would probably like to have Kazakhstan as well. He's on his way to getting Ukraine. Who knows what he'll do with the Baltic states. He's pushing for security, and I think is very much affected by history. But what I think is going to be a problem for the West is to sustain any sort of long-term support for those in Ukraine who don't want to be ruled by Russia. And you know, we talk about history and we talk about historical claims, but we also have another principle, and that's self-determination. Yeah. And I think the Ukrainian people have made it very, very clear. They voted 90% to be independent in 1991. They look westwards. They don't look eastwards.
Neil, I know you visit the country annually. You've got a very good knowledge of what people think there. Do you think the West just didn't react after what happened in Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014 in an effective or considered way? Did it just sort of fall back into happy talk and a belief that these very important principles about not revising borders by force had been breached, and yet somehow they preferred not to rearm or take it more seriously?
Well, I'm afraid there was a clear failure to learn from history here. It wasn't hard to see that Putin was planning the invasion of Ukraine, but when I predicted it in a column on January the 2nd, there was general incredulity. Actually was in Kiev back in September, and I was aghast to realize not only the intentions of the Russian government, but also the complete lack of readiness on the part of the European Union to show any interest in Ukraine's becoming a member. And the same went for NATO, which basically said, sorry, you'll have to wait indefinitely. So basically, the Ukrainian government was left in limbo last year, and nobody seemed to realize that sanctions had not worked in 2014. They hadn't deterred, nor had they made Putin change his position when it came to the annexation of Crimea. And threatening sanctions in the run-up to this invasion has been a complete failure. The result is a catastrophe from the point of view of Western diplomacy, because I think it's highly likely that Putin's blitzkrieg will be successful. I think he will have destroyed most of the conventional forces Ukraine has at its disposal within a matter of weeks. The only question that's unclear to me is whether there will be significant and sustained resistance against this Russian invasion. And I think that will be the critical factor in the coming weeks.
We're almost out of time. I'm sorry, Neil, but very quickly, Margaret Macmillan, do you worry that Putin might succeed here, that this might be the end of a sort of liberal worldview?
Of course, yes, I think I do. I mean, it's already been under pressure. Our institutions, which we have done very well by since 1945, such as the UN, have been under pressure. I think we are entering into a new world, and others will now, I think, follow his example.
Margaret Macmillan, Neil Ferguson, thank you both indeed very much. That's all from us tonight. Faisal will be back here tomorrow. Till then, sleep well. Good night.